Play Now online in NBA 2K is one of the most popular modes year in and year out. The simple concept of one user controlling one team versus another user controlling another team is always fun. Play Now online is one of the game modes that I am most passionate about, so I wanted to make a video detailing how I approach my games. Now, this is going to be a two-part video, with this first video detailing how I attack on offense, and the second video detailing how I play defense. Now, before we jump into the details of what it is I do on offense, I wanted to take a quick second to introduce myself and introduce this channel, especially this channel since it's in the very early stages. So I've been playing NBA 2K for fun, for a very long time now. I would say going back to at least NBA 2K11, I think is when I got started. Could have been a little bit earlier than that. But I play on Xbox, and I play under this gamertag right here. I'll also list that in the description just for the heck of it.
Now, again, I want to give you guys just, a little bit of a look into my history as a 2K gamer, just more so like for context behind this video, right? 2K11 was the first edition that I played, at least on Xbox. That is, if you don't count College Hoops 2K8. 2K18 was the first time that I made the original greatest of all time tier. Obviously, 2K did away with that for this year with the original, greatest of all time, and then the original tiered system. They did away with that in 2K25. But I played a bunch in 2K20, made some leaderboard appearances, and then in some subsequent games after that. This was my Season 8 record, and then you also see my overall record there in 2K25. Now, before we jump into the details of this video, got one last note. Obviously, the goal of this video is to, help you win more games in Play Now Online in NBA 2K. But more than that, I want this video just to kind of be like a tips and tricks type of video, things that I've just picked up on. Of course, it's going to be overall a breakdown of my scheme and my game plan on offense and defense, but more than that, I want just little tips and tricks to be sprinkled in there for you to use how you see fit within your game. And I mentioned earlier that this channel is very much in the early stages, and I think that that's really what I want this channel to be, is just something where you can pick up tips and tricks and hopefully a lot of different nuances and details about 2K that you may have not thought about before. And I want it to just be an outlet for me to talk about one of the things that is, the most fun to me, is not only basketball, but just 2K and Play Now Online and my career. And I also want you to be able to do the same thing. So if you got any comments, feel free to add them and come along for the ride. Without further ado, let's get into the details. Now, this video is going to be broken up into 5 different parts. With the first one being what I call my ball screen series, which is essentially just my half-court offense. Thought it made sense to start there. The second kind of part of this video will be attacking against a zone, which is definitely something that you'll see, from time to time, maybe even a little bit more than that on Play Now Online in 2K. Third, we will go over, kind of just the idea of fast break in transition. That would just be, after your opponent misses a shot or off a turnover, that can also make up a good bulk of a game. So it's important, kind of just some notes on that. And then the fourth part of this video is going to be about controlling the game and kind of time of possession in general. This is something that's obviously very important in real basketball, and equally, if not, more important in 2K in my eyes. And it's also something that I don't think a lot of people think about on 2K, or maybe just don't, consider important enough, if that makes sense. And then the last thing, lastly, kind of just to conclude the video, we'll go over just some miscellaneous notes, tips and tricks, that type of thing, just to conclude things.
To kick things off for the ball screen series, we've got the emphasis on the pick and slip. Now, what makes this offense unique is that you can set it up for the half court right when the ball is inbounded. Here I am using the Timberwolves, and take a look at Naz Reid. Now, he just stepped into play, and I've already called for him to set a screen. Now, I think this is a great way to start an offensive possession, as it gives you a great chance for some early offense, and it can also open up a couple of other things right off of that. As we progress up the court, I think your first read in this offense is getting all the way to the basket with a point guard if you can. And here we score with Conley doing just that. Here's another similar example. We call for the ball screen by hitting LB on Xbox, and this time we wait until we cross half court to do so. Now, something to point out here is that you are more likely to get the drive with the ball handler if your opponent is controlling the on-ball defender. Right, so here my opponent shays to the left just a little bit with Rodman in anticipation of the screen that's coming, and that opens up a driving lane for Randall. Now we're getting into part of the bread and butter of this offense, and that is the pick and slip itself. Now, setting up the same way here by calling for the ball screen right off the inbound, we've got Randall setting a pick on the left side. And what I'm trying to do here with Conley as we advance up the court is work my way into the middle to at least give the impression that I'm going to use the screen that he's setting. And also notice that my opponent is not using the on-ball defender, so that leads me to believe that I'm not going to be able to get the drive with the ball handler like we previously did. Now, as Randall approaches for the screen, I'm first reading his defender. If the screener's defender bites up, like he does in this clip, then you can hit LB again to cancel the screen. And that'll get your roll man to dive directly to the hoop for an easy bucket.
Here's another example of the pick and slip, this time coming off a Misc shot. Now we get into this same action, which is considered a drag screen as well, especially when this screen is being set by the inbounder, but it can also work the same way off a Misc shot or a turnover. Now my opponent is actually doing a pretty good job of using and finding over what he thinks is a screen. But since his focus is on getting over that screen, we're able to click LB to send Randall on a slip as we get his defender out of position again. Another important point on the pick and slip out of the drag screen is that this can also be run without a traditional big. Now let's take a look at the personnel here as I'm using the 76ers. So Paul George is playing the 4 and Oubre is at the 3. Now typically when you call for a ball screen, either the 4 or the 5 is going to be the one to set it, depending on whoever is closest to the ball handler. But if you call for a screen when the 4 or the 5 have the ball in their hand, that opens up a chance for the 3, Kelly Oubre in this scenario, to be able to set a screen. Now this is a good example in this play because Anthony Davis is guarding Paul George. So this is a way that we can keep AD away from the rim so that we can create leverage again for Kelly Oubre to get downhill and score. Now, these next few examples are important because they will highlight why I consider this offense a ball screen series. And that's because you can run this pretty much continuously throughout a half-court offensive possession. But with different things mixed in here and there, so it's not looking 100% identical every time. Now here we first try to hit Gobert on a cut, but it's not there. So we kick it out and swing the ball up top. Now here this naturally leads to another pick and slip as we're able to get Randall going downhill against the CPU defender. Now again with the Timberwolves in a different game, we try to get Randall on an initial screen, but it's not there. So we get him a touch up top and immediately look for another screen, especially as Naz Reid appears to have a mismatch. And it's the same thing that opens up this bucket as Zubac is pulled away from the paint and we get Reid going downhill on good timing. And finally, with the Sixers, we try to get Embiid on a drag screen, but it isn't there at first. Now, we also catch our opponent off-ball defending a shooter in the corner, so we get a ball reversal right to Grimes. Now, from there, we get another ball reversal to a mismatch, followed by very quickly, emphasis on the very quickly, calling for a screen from PG and then canceling that screen, like almost instantaneously to get him going downhill to the basket. Now, this can be ran over and over again throughout an offensive possession, again, until you find what you're looking for. I think it's important to also note that you can use this offense to attack when one of your bigs has a mismatch in their favor. Now here we got 7'3" Kristaps Porzingis being defended by a guard. And my opponent does a pretty good job helping off the ball handler, but we're still able to quickly get Porzingis in great position. Now here, right from the jump, as I'm using the Bucks, we see that Giannis has Josh Hart guarding him. So we're able to just work the ball around, get a quick ball reversal, and then get Giannis going downhill to attack.
Now the last big thing to point out with this pick and slip drag screen offense is that it has big potential to open up shooters. Now here again with the 76ers, and as we turn the corner on the initial screen, you can see our shooter's defender in the corner has started to help off his man in response to our ball screen action. Now in these cases, it's a simple dot to the corner for a great look. Now again with the T-Wolves, we get into our usual action, but this time we reject the ball screen, as we have space with our opponent controlling the on-ball defender. Now this leads to the same look, as the corner shooter's defender helps on the drive again, and we're able to hit Ant. Now, before we resume the clip and pass on the ball, I want to note a small detail on this type of action. Right, once we hit Ant here, you'll see that we wait for just a split second before we shoot it. And the reason for this is because once we pass the ball to the corner, I am keeping an eye on this defender right here. Now if he doesn't rotate to the corner, like in this video, then we have the open 3. This next clip is just the next progression from that previous look. We turn the corner off our pick and slip attempt, and we recognize the corner defender helping off again, so we pass to the corner. But this time, the wing defender shades over a bit more, and my opponent clicks on to cover the shooter. So in this scenario, all we have to do is make the extra pass and hit the shooter on the wing for a great look. The next set of clips are more the same, with us generating open looks, from defenders helping off of shooters in response to our initial ball screen action. Now sometimes it takes a little patience for shooters to open up, off of this action, but it's inevitable if you set up your pick and slip effectively enough, and if your opponent isn't solid enough on defense.
This time, we're able to locate an open shooter later in the possession, as we're already into the ball screen series. Now you can see we tried the initial drag screen action with Paul George, but it's not there. So we get Maxi a touch, and then we go right back into it with Embiid setting the screen, which that eventually opens up the left side. And the ways to find open shooters in this offense are endless, in my eyes. As here we hit the initial pick and slip, but then catch our opponent helping off the corner for another great look. Here's another example with the Pacers. And see how, we wait for just a second here after we turn the corner with Halliburton. And we see that something's going to open up on the right side, but we're not exactly sure what it is yet. And this time, the wing eventually opens up first for a 3 instead of the corner. Before we move on to the pick and pop, I've got one final note. Now, in pretty much all these previous clips for section 1A, you saw us attack on offense utilizing the initial ball screen, but not necessarily in a traditional way. A lot of the times, we're having the initial ball screen slip, and he's not even making contact with the defender that he's approaching, as if he was going to set the screen. And I think that's really effective, especially in 2K, but I just want to call out that it is also really effective to still utilize a traditional pick and roll where the screener actually makes contact. So just don't forget that you can do that too. And that's also a good reminder for myself as well to not forget that, as that can complement the pick and slip really well also. Speaking of complementing the pick and slip, the pick and pop does a great job of that as well. Now I mentioned the pick and slip being the bread and butter of this offense, and I would consider the pick and pop to be that also. Now we're going to start this section the same way as we did the pick and slip. And what I want to point out again is, don't forget to be a threat with the ball handler. And that goes for whether you're calling for a pick and roll or a pick and fade. Now here with Randall, we had McDaniels on a pick and pop, but we're able to get all the way to the rim ourselves, before anything else opens up. Now, here with the Pacers, we work a pick and pop, our ball screen series. So we call for the usual initial drag screen slip by Obi Toppin. We try to get it to him, but it's not there, so we kick it right back to Halliburton. Now, instead of running another pick and slip or pick and roll, we'll put Obi Toppin on a fade. Now, you do this by clicking RB in this screen menu to switch to fade instead of roll. You do that while you're holding LB, to call for the screen. Now, we see the user help off with the big, and it's a wide open look for Toppin. And here's another note related to the ball screen menu that pops up while you call for a ball screen. Now, it's worth noting, too, that you can push the left stick in to change the side that the screen is set on, as we do that here to get an open drive with Tatum. Here again with the Timberwolves, and this clip is another good example of why I think of this offense as a series of actions. As we don't find a look on our first pick and pop attempt, but we do eventually create some space for Naz Reid on a pass from Randall. And it's worth noting too that while you've seen us run the pick and pop for mid-range looks a few times, it can of course be a great way to set up shooters for threes as well, as you see Porzingis get a great look off that same action. Another important point on the ball screen series is that you can use the pick and pop as the initial action instead of the pick and slip. Now, of course, you're seeing us start most possessions, with the pick and slip drag screen we've talked about. But here, our first half-court action is the pick and pop to get a great look for Paul George. So don't forget to mix up how you start your possessions, from time to time as well. Another great thing about the pick and pop is that it can also open up spot-up shooters, just like the pick and slip can. This next set of clips will highlight that. Now here we get Tatum on a pick and pop, but Horford's man rotates over, so we make the extra pass to him for a good look that unfortunately misses. Here's another example, with me controlling the Bucks as the user defender in the corner is put in a difficult position. And this time, back into the pick and pop action with the T-Wolves, and we're able to cause the defense to rotate off a shooter, this time from our drive alone, and we dot McDaniels for a three. These next two clips will highlight how you can use the pick and pop to create a mismatch. Here, Jordan is forced to switch on to Naz Reid on the pop, and then we're able to quickly take advantage of that switch. And finally, here's some great ball movement with the Celtics. Now we force them into a switch to cover Porzingis on the pop, then we work the ball around a few times to eventually get an open look back for Porzingis with a smaller player contesting. Now, my last note on the pick and pop is it is very smart and perhaps even necessary to use this against higher level competition. And, the reason I say that is because the first part of this video, the pick and slip, pick and roll, drag screen, that tends to be taken away by higher level players, in my opinion and my experience. So having the pick and pop to go to is crucial because the pick and pop requires, even more quick reaction time and switching to stop the majority of the time, especially if your opponent is in man-to-man. Now, let's get into how to attack a zone. For this section, all of the clips here are going to come from this one game, with me controlling the Pacers against the Suns. Now, as noted earlier, zone defense is something that you'll see relatively often in Play Now Online, and in 2K in general. But it's my opinion that zone is a lot more viable in Rec than it is in Play Now Online. And I think that's because in Rec, you have 5 user defenders who can, of course, rotate around and cover ground, whereas there's only one user defender in Play Now Online, obviously. So a zone in Play Now Online will naturally cover less ground and tends to be less active. And I've always been of the opinion that in Play Now, if you, as my opponent, are going to sit back in the zone, then we will make you pay for leaving shooters open in space. Now, my opponent in this game was in a 2-3 zone for essentially the entire game, so I think this is a great example. It's worth noting, too, that the 2-3 defense is generally the only zone defense that you'll see in Play Now Online, but these principles could work against any, type of zone defense. Now here, you see the typical look of how the zone will set up in the half court. And the main thing that you should take away from this section is that the best way that we're able to consistently attack a zone is by quickly and effectively setting up our spot-up shooters. Now this first clip has my opponent set up in the zone, but he's pressing up just a bit with one of the top defenders. Now what I want to point out here is that you can still start possessions against a zone by calling for a drag screen or a pick and fade, just like we do normally when attacking man defense with the pick and slip or the pick and pop. Now, obviously, Jarris Walker here isn't going to be the same threat going downhill, as he would be if we were attacking against man with the pick and slip. But he gives us an outlet here if we need it, and he gets some early movement going, against the zone, which is a good thing as well. And we eventually get a ball reversal into a good look for Siakam. Now, one great way to attack against a zone is to try to get looks before the zone can get set. Now here we get a good look early, and we get lucky with an offensive rebound. Now, to be honest, I don't have any different type of offense that I run against a zone per se, and the reason for that is because I'm a believer that if you can read the defense and the space well enough, and if you can icon pass effectively enough, then you're going to be able to work the ball around and find shooters open against a zone. Now here we get into our normal action of calling for a ball screen, despite the defense being in the zone, and we cause a lapse in the zone that eventually results in a corner three.
Here's another good example of our players just naturally getting into good positions against the zone. Here we think we might get a late transition look, but instead we kick it out, make a quick swing pass, and get a good look against the zone. These next two clips again showcase attacking early against the zone by letting our shooters spot up. Now, another big note I want to make on playing against a zone is that usually players who run the 2-3 zone are going to be people who gamble for steals and try to reach a lot, because that's part of kind of what they rely on to try to get stops. And in the first clip here, we catch our opponent reaching twice, and then we get an open early look. And then in the second clip, you again see the importance of being patient on offense and waiting until after the user reaches to pass the ball to who it is that's open. So reading the floor and reading the user is always important, but I think even more so against a zone.
And to add on that point, just because the user reaches and gets out of position early doesn't mean that something will be open right away. So when playing against a zone, it's also important, to be patient and willing to make an extra pass or two to set up a shooter. And while things such as ball movement and taking care of the ball are extra important when playing against a zone, it's worth pointing out too that you have to balance that with also being very decisive when you see an opening. Now here we're able to be just patient enough to hold it for a second with Halliburton, and then Obi Toppin comes open again. Now a good nugget before we move forward, when I used the Pacers in 2K25, I started Obi Toppin at the 4 and Siakam at the 3 so that Obi could be my main roll man for the pick and slip offense. But in this game against the Suns, when we aren't really using that pick and slip much because of the zone, it becomes a lot more important to get as much shooting out there as possible. Now, Obi's not a bad shooter, and you've seen us make a few with him, but the point is that you want to maximize the shooting you have on the floor against the zone in order to fully space it out. And of course, we have to make the classic point of attacking the weak spot of the 2-3 zone, which is the middle. Now here the zone is fully set up off a dead ball, and this possession is a good example again of being patient and careful as we wait a second until we get the ball out of Halliburton's hands. Now look where Miles Turner catches the ball. Okay, we get it to him where we know there's going to be space, especially since he's a big and the two guys defending the areas beside him are smaller players. And this time the user clicks on to take away Turner. So we're able to find a shooter after we broke down the zone by getting a touch in the middle. Here's another example of simple offense breaking down a zone, as all we need on this possession is a quick ball reversal from Halliburton to Nembhard for a great look. Also, this is another good example of why you should still call for the initial drag screen when going up against a zone, especially if the user is playing up and reaching like they are here. Now, take a look at Turner. Now, he is way late on setting the screen. I mean, he's barely even in the picture here. But, the fact that we set him on a roll earlier is the reason why he's diving through the lane here. And it just so happens that, he does so right as we get our ball reversal, and that helps occupy the defense to give Nembhard space to spot up.
And lastly, here's another example of why I actually kind of like playing against a zone, at least in play now. And again, as long as you're taking care of the ball and quickly reading, the weak spots of the zone, then I'm of the belief that you'll have no problem creating more than enough good looks to win.
The fast break is maybe the most exciting part of basketball, and it can be a lot of fun in play now online as well. Now, as mentioned earlier, fast break offense will make up a decent portion of most games, so it's important to have at least somewhat of a strategy, for what to do on the fast break. Now, in this first clip, I want to point out that when we can get something quick and easy, we need to take it when it's there, as we do that same thing here with Taurean Prince off a pass in transition. And if we watch this clip again, notice what it is that springs Prince open. Now, it's actually our opponent clicking on and reaching for a steal that's not there. And we made this point in the last section of attacking, before a zone gets set up, and these same principles apply. if you can catch your opponent reaching on the fast break, then more than likely you're going to get an open three or a dunk.
Here's another example of reading the defense after we force a turnover and then hitting the open man after our opponent reaches. In this clip, we have the open three with Randall, but no need to settle if we can get all the way to the rim. Now, here we're getting into what is maybe my favorite pass to make in all of 2K, and I think it's also a really important pass that not enough players talk about or think about. And here we get a change of possession, and Bobby Portis has the ball. Now, I like to refer to this pass as a drop-off pass, and what I'm referring to is this pass that Portis makes to Giannis. Now, on the surface, this pass looks like any other pass, but I feel like it's so much more than that, because not only does this pass get the ball out of the big man's hands safely, but it also springs Giannis forward, and it starts a fast break that we get an open three on. And as a side note, I think that this type of pass is also really important in rec as well, if you're a big man, and it can just go a long way in setting up good looks in transition. Here's another example of utilizing this type of pass to eventually open up a shooter in transition. Now this time it's a little different as it's CP3 making the pass to Wemby, but it's the same concept as that drop-off pass keeps our fast break going and puts the user in a difficult position. Another important point for attacking on the fast break is rewarding your bigs for running the floor. Now this is a classic fast break point, and it's so effective because it gives you a way to quickly get your big a look right at the rim. Now here we're able to locate that Wemby is unaccounted for on the break, so we stall for just a bit with CP3 before we hit Wemby right in stride for an easy two. Here's another example of identifying when a player is running in space in transition. Now we make one pass up the court, and then we notice Paul George running the floor late. Now this time it's not our big that's running the floor, but it's the same idea as we hit PG for a bucket just like we found Wemby in the last clip.
And lastly, this is a great example of how you can also attack late in transition, in particular with a ball handler. Now here off a rebound, Halliburton is able to get up in space and he turns a corner. Now notice that we've got our icons up. So we're not only looking for a layup, but also for an open shooter. In this case, Nembhard for a three. And again, attacking on the fast break, makes up just a small portion of the game, but it can really be a fun way to create looks, and it can also give you a lot of easy looks before the defense sets up. Now, let's talk about an overlooked part of the game, time of possession. Controlling the game through time of possession is something that's small, but it can really add up throughout a game, and these clips will show that. Now, when I say time of possession, I'm not only referring to the actual time of possession stat that's in the team stats at the end of each game, but what I'm talking about is more so something that you kind of have to have a feel for, like as the game progresses. Now, these situations that I'm referring to where the time of possession becomes more important is 1, at the end of a quarter or a half, and 2, when we're leading and the game is getting late. Now, this first clip is a good example with us approaching the end of the first quarter. Now notice how we wait just a second in the half court before we get the ball to our shooter. And we don't score, but we do get a good look, and most importantly, our opponent isn't able to get anything better than a last second heave. This second clip is another similar example, and it's a quick one. Now notice we get possession with just about 9 seconds left in the first half, and we advance the ball up quickly, but I'm very intentional about not just crossing half court and shooting right away. And instead, we hold on to it with Halliburton again for just a second before we find a shooter to close out the half. Here's a different type of example, but it's the same big picture idea of time of possession. Now, what's important here is the score and where we're at in the game. Now, obviously, we're in total control, but even if the game were a bit closer and more competitive, the way that I would start to approach possessions at this point in the game, changes just a bit, as we'll start to get slightly more conservative to wind the clock. Now here, we might have a look with Randall, but our focus is on, again, working the clock just a bit and starting to extend possessions, so we work it around and then eventually find Gobert on a mismatch.
Now, to conclude this section, I'm going to show some extended clips from this game of me as the Celtics against another user controlling the Cavs. Now we're going to kick things off with the possession right before halftime, and then we'll take a closer look at the fourth quarter as well. Now here the game clock's at 21 seconds, and the shot clock is off, so we know that we can make this the last possession of the half. Now the shot that we end up getting really is not a good look, as we'll end up with a contested jumper by Derek White. But what's more important is the fact that we secured the end of the half without our opponent getting another look. Now, for instance, if we had taken this same shot with 10 seconds left on the game clock, then it would have been a terrible shot, obviously, since our opponent likely would have gotten the ball back. But again, since we made sure our opponent didn't get another touch, this makes it not a bad possession in my eyes, and worth pointing out. And also, as you'll see later in this game, it's this type of thinking that comes back to help us down the stretch.
Here, starting the fourth quarter, and we're in no rush, as we built up at least a bit of a cushion. And what I want to point out here again is the score and the game clock. As you can see, this is a pretty low-scoring game. Now, this is how a lot of games can go, especially when you're playing Play Now Online against higher level or experienced players. And in these games that can be a little bit lower scoring and slower paced, I think it's that much more important to think about the time of possession and controlling the game, as that can be the difference late. Now here, again, we're not in any rush as we're up 5, and we're able to work the ball around and then eventually get a great look for a 3 with the shot clock all the way down to 7. Now, this clip is a great example to show that you still have to keep a balance on offense between chewing some clock and attacking to find good looks. Now here, we're being patient as we come up the floor, but we get a relatively early look for Porzingis that we can't pass up, as it's still just a 5-point game. And finally, this last extended clip shows how you can ice a game after you've built up a lead by taking the game possession by possession and using the clock to your favor. Now here, with just under a minute and a half left in the game, and before we start this, I want to point out that we don't score for the rest of this game. And it didn't matter because of how well we took care of the ball and worked the clock. We also played great defense here, which we'll get into that in part 2 of this video. But on our first possession here, you see the little ball fake with Tatum. And as a small detail, I love doing this late in games. Now, obviously, this isn't going to fake the defense out or anything, but it assures that you'll just pick the ball up and you shouldn't turn it over, which is important at this point. So you do that by pressing B and Y at the same time on Xbox. And now after we do that here, we're simply just winding down the clock with our lead before we eventually get another open look. Now, we'll fast forward through this defensive possession, but what we've done here is completely slow down this game. And we're able to get one stop defensively, which effectively ends it at this point. On the last possession, it's more the same for us as we take some time off the clock and then get another open look before we secure the win. Now, let's dive into the final part of this video. To conclude this video, I've got a few final miscellaneous notes to make. Now I want to kick things off with quickly discussing the idea of moving shots. Now these have been popular for a while in 2K, especially in my career, and they're great to utilize when needed in Play Now Online as well. Now to note, what I mean by a moving shot is simply, when you're dribbling with the ball handler and you use your momentum to go right into a pull-up jump shot, like you see with CP3 here. This next clip is a good example of going to a moving shot when it's late in the possession and there's nothing there. Now here, we get a corner look for Ant. And this also shows that these can be a little bit OP at times as well. Now, moving shots are just really hard to defend, contest in general, and this is something that is usually the case year to year in 2K. Here's another good miscellaneous note for half-court offense, and that's the idea of hitting the inbounder after an out-of-bounds play, in particular, a sideline out-of-bounds play. Now, on these types of plays in 2K, it just feels like the inbounder tends to naturally do a good job of diving towards the rim. As here we hit Porzingis for a bucket. And then here's another similar example in a different game, as we'll again see how easy it is for the inbounder to spring open, as again we get another easy 2. Here's another small thing you can do during a game that can give you an advantage. Now, we're in between quarters in this game, and take a look at the menu that pops up here. Now this is the idea of quick subs. And you can make these in-game, in between quarters, and while the game's going on. Now you bring up this menu by pressing down on the D-pad on Xbox. And here you can see an example also of us using it as the game's going on. Now this is great if you're wanting to make a quick change, for whatever reason, without having to fully take a timeout. And it's also worth noting too that you're a little bit limited on which players can go in which positions when you're using this quick sub menu, especially as compared to when you're making subs during an actual timeout where you have total control to put any player in any position. Something else that makes a difference in Play Now games is your coach settings in the pause menu. Now, there are a lot of other settings that I usually change before each game, We'll get into those in part 2 of this video as they mostly relate to defense. But 2 changes that I like to make before each game that relate to offense are to turn both timeout and subs to manual, as well as player minutes, although I'm not sure if that one matters. And this just makes sure that we're fully in control of both of these things and don't leave it up to the CPU. And while we're in this game, for example purposes, something else that I want to point out that we haven't talked about yet is that you can run set plays. Now to do this, you're going to click left on the D-pad on Xbox, then you'll click your play. You can see they're getting into some action. And, to be honest, this isn't something that I do a ton, as we do get a pretty good look there. This is not something that I do a ton, but this is something that I've worked in here and there. And the one thing to note is that with set plays, it's best if you can find a play where there's an off-ball screen for a shooter, actually, as you saw in that clip. Those tend to be the best in 2K. Again, not something that I use a ton, but worth pointing out. The very last thing that I want to touch on in this video is the Learn 2K Freestyle. Now, this little testing area has been great to me because I kind of love to just use this as a way to warm up before games. And this has also been great for 2K25 Play Now Online because the way that Play Now is set up in 2K25, if you win a game with a team, that team is locked for you. You can't use that team again for like the next 5 to 6 games. So having just a little mode like this where you can go in and test a team that, right before you're about to use them really helps a lot, helps learn player-specific things. And again, I definitely don't think that you have to do this right before every single game, probably more so just a personal preference thing, but another small thing that I found has helped me.
If you made it to this part of the video, thank you so much. I sincerely appreciate it. If you have any comments, please feel free to add them. I love talking basketball and NBA 2K, so I'll be happy to respond. Part 2 of this video will be coming soon. That'll be the same type of video, but just from the defensive perspective. And lastly, NBA 2K26 comes out very soon. I think it's about 4 days away from the point of me posting this. So please feel free to subscribe. I'll have more content about Play Now Online. I'm also gonna have some My Career content worked in. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you in part 2.